Good morning. My name is Byron Holt. I'm the chief of planning with East Bay Regional Park District, and it's an honor to be with you this morning and speaking about the Delta and Carquinez Straits World War II heritage, particularly today on the 75th anniversary of D-Day. A very relevant and timely topic. We've got with us today Janet Sakata and Jean Yokotobi with the Delta Education Cultural Society, Jean Bigler, University of the Pacific, and Carol Jensen, East Contra Costa Historical Society. So with that, I think we're going to jump right into it. I think we're going in order here with Janet and Jean starting us off.
Good morning. My name is Janet Sakata, and I'm just going to give you a brief history of the Japan towns in California. In 2006 and 7, Preserving California Japantowns completed reconnaissance level surveys in nearly 50 communities from San Diego to Marysville. In our Sacramento Delta area, we surveyed communities in nearby Florin, Isleton, Marysville, French Camp, Lodi, Sacramento, Stockton, and Walnut Grove. I was part of the Walnut Grove team. Historically, all these Japantown communities included such services as community halls, language schools, bathhouses, Buddhist churches and Christian churches, markets, nurseries, and other Japanese businesses. I learned that it was a thriving community. When I did the survey in Walnut Grove, I learned that it was a thriving community which served the Japanese and other ethnicities, with businesses such as laundry, dry cleaners, tailor shops, shoe repair, pharmaceutical, dental, dry goods, groceries, and other businesses, as well as social services such as they had quite a few pool halls, they had a theater, they had a lot of eateries, and we had surveyed Walnut Grove and we created this map. Oops. Jean has a smaller version of the map, but it just kind of gives you an idea of what was in the town and what the Japanese created in Japantown, Walnut Grove. And then I'm going to let Jean take over, and she has quite a bit of information for you.
Before I get into the economic impact of Executive Order 9066, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what 9066, Executive Order 9066 was. Okay. Wow, I have two mics.
You can pass it on another one. Right.
Anyway, 9066 was an executive order that was signed in 1942 by Roosevelt, President Roosevelt. It was an executive order to incarcerate all of the Japanese on the West Coast. And so the West Coast included Washington, Oregon, California, and Arizona. At that time, when the executive order was signed, we had 110,000 Japanese living on the West Coast. This executive order only impacted the West Coast. People on the East Coast were not really aware of what was happening. And what I really wanted to share with you is there were a lot of events that brought us to the incarceration of the Japanese. I have handouts for you. I have handouts to show evidence of what happened all throughout the years before the internment. So I'm going to just briefly start from when the Japanese first came here, which was around 1869, and they came here to establish the Wakamatsu tea and silk colony in Placerville. So what happened was the Chinese were here before the Japanese. So the Chinese, were here for the gold rush and the building of the railroad. Even before the Japanese came, the Chinese were impacted by anti-Chinese sentiments, and there was a lot of things happening. There's a lot of laws and ordinances and attitudes that really affected the Chinese. And then, from that, you had the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. From that Exclusion Act, that is when the Japanese came into the United States because of the shortage of labor. So they came in, and as they were coming in, there was the anti-Japanese sentiment starting to brew. very early on. And so you will see, if you read this, in this timeline, by the way, and I'm going to give credit to, there was an exhibit in San Francisco, then they came for me exhibit. And so this timeline actually came from that exhibit, but I've added a few things to it. With the Japanese coming after 1882, they started really very soon after. Laws were being passed, resolutions towards the Japanese. And there is one in 1905. California, this is the legislature, passes a resolution that says Japanese laborers by reason of race, habits, mode of living, disposition, and general characteristics are undesirable and barred from naturalization. For the next 40 years, there was anti-Japanese bills introduced to the legislature for 40 years. And then in 1906, you had the segregation of schools in San Francisco, and that impacted Walnut Grove and Ileton. That particular, the segregation of schools wasn't statewide, it was really more in the Northern California, Central Valley area. As the Japanese were settling, and then you have the Alien Land Law Act that was introduced in 1913. And so that prohibited the Japanese immigrants from owning land. So all of these things are being introduced. The media played a huge part in the anti-Japanese movement. In your handout, you'll see some of the things that were happening from the media standpoint. Also locally, Dr. Seuss, did anti-Japanese cartoons. But if you really look on the website, there's thousands of anti-Japanese cartoons, photos, and things like that. So this movement started very early on, which really influenced the attitude of people when the executive order came about. I'm not going to go through this timeline in detail. So I think it's easy for you to actually read this and sort of understand what happened. But executive order, when Hawaii was bombed, executive order was signed by, like I said, President Roosevelt. What they did was they set up 10 relocation centers. The 110,000 Japanese were removed at that time. What I would like to just go into next is, and Janet talked about Walnut Grove, and I'm going to talk about Ileton. So Ileton, if you look at the map of Ileton, this was a map. This map shows you the businesses that were in Ileton at that time. In Ileton, we had the Chinese community and the Japanese community living together in one area. And that was true in several places in California. Marysville also had a Japanese section and a Chinese section in one area. This was the commercial hub of Ileton. There was, on this map, I didn't give you the Chinese section, but at the other end, there was the Chinese part of this settlement. I also have a map here. During that time, of course, asparagus was a big commodity. So, you had 10 asparagus factories or canneries between Ileton and I think Clarksburg, might have gone all the way down to Clarksburg. But you had 3 canneries in Ileton. 90% of the workforce for the canneries were Asians, Japanese and Chinese. If you could sort of visualize the number of people, first of all, the Japanese living there and even Chinese, but if you can just visualize all these people having businesses there and also working at the canneries, also you had farming going on in the area, they were removed. And they were removed, the internment allowed you 2 days to 2 weeks to pack up your things and get rid of all your personal belongings and be ready to move. I can tell you that was a huge impact not only on the community where all these businesses had to close, or they had to sell their assets, or just get rid of things. And then that left a hole in even Walnut Grove and Ileton for the economic viability of that community. When the Japanese were removed, what happened right after that in 1942 was the Bracero program to help with the labor shortage. So you can see what happened when all the Japanese were removed. It left a big hole for labor, and they had to bring in labor to help revitalize some of these communities and some of these businesses. I also want to talk about the impact of the internees and the economic impact of the internees. You have to remember they were only allowed to take two whatever they can carry in two hands. Plus, you know, they've already disposed of all their assets. They were sent to the camps, and they were barracks. So they were barracks that were divided up into households. And I'm referencing my family because I have these documents, and I think it's very good for you to see these documents because you'll probably never see them elsewhere. But this is the list. It says personal property. And when my parents were ready to leave camp, this is what the government was going to ship back to their hometown of Gridley. And you can see there's very few items, but you have to remember you were probably living in the space of about 20 by 20 or something smaller. So you couldn't have a lot of furniture. And I know for a fact my father made a lot of furniture. I have still some of his chests that he had built for the family. And also I want you to think, this is what they're going to come back to. This is all they had. My mother and my father, my sister who was 7 years old, and I was a baby. I was born in camp. And they had $60 and they were put on the train back to Gridley. So they basically lost everything and had to start over with really nothing. So I think it's interesting to see that because people don't realize, and the difficulty of starting over, and we're going to just briefly touch on Gammon, and it's a Japanese Buddhist term on why the Japanese were able to probably survive after that. And then the last thing I'm going to share with you is the government actually approached my family for reimbursement of lost crop. And this is in 1955. And so here it is from 1942 and now 1955, and I have a letter for you. They're saying, this is the part that's very interesting. It says, by law, in fact, they have to reimburse you for your lost crop. But by law, in fact, did that apply to the incarceration of the Japanese? So my parents actually, they said that we were owed $5,000 for the clean peaches, but so they had to get an attorney who was able to get them $7,000. But you're talking about almost 10 years. One of the things my father mentioned to me right after the signing of the 1988 Civil Liberties Act, he was able to talk about it a little bit, but my parents really never discussed it with the children. But one thing my father said was, you know, they gave us only a week to dispose of all of our assets or everything. And he had asked the government official, can you just give me time to harvest my crop? He said, it's ready to harvest. And they said no. And he said that just broke his heart because he worked all year to harvest this crop and he couldn't do it.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial, and just I'll give a brief introduction for those who may not be familiar. The East Bay Regional Park District, we own and manage 120,000 acres in Alameda and Contra Costa County, and that includes the East Contra Costa County shoreline portion of the Delta. And I'll give just a quick little plug of one of the projects we've been working on is developing what we're calling the East Contra Costa County Delta Atlas, so sort of a mapping exercise looking at opportunities, constraints, and different items in the Delta. We do currently operate the Big Break Regional Shoreline in Antioch, if you haven't, or in Oakley, if you haven't been out there, a really great facility, and then a couple other planned parks. One of our latest efforts has been working on the closure of the former Concord Naval Weapons Station, but as part of that, working in partnership with the National Park Service on the Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial. So I guess just a quick show of hands, who is familiar with the history of Port Chicago? So pretty good. That's more than I usually get in a presentation. Just another quick question: who has actually been out to the Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial? That's about what I would expect. The Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial is it's actually within the Military Ocean Terminal Concord, which is an active Army base. So this is a National Park Service, National Park site that is not accessible to the public. And further, you can get reservations, you can go out there, but you do have to be a documented U.S. citizen. So I'll go into some of the history of what Port Chicago is and why it's relevant. And a lot of folks are familiar with the explosion of Port Chicago, but they're not as familiar with the aftermath and really the history that Port Chicago had and really leading to desegregation of the military. Here's where we're at. If you're somewhat familiar, we're on the Delta, on the Strait. There was two portions of the former Concord Naval Weapons Station, the tidal area and the inland area. The inland area closed down in 2005. So since that time, the City of Concord and the Park District have been working on what the reuse of that site is. About 2,500 acres of that area will be a new regional park. That'll be transferred from the Navy to the East Bay Regional Park District, and we're actually hopeful that that will happen by the end of next week. So I've been working really hard on that. And then the tidal area where the actual National Park Service site is remains in active Army use. And you can see a picture there on top. That's what the actual Naval Magazine National Memorial looks like. And then the area with the munition magazines, that's the inland area. This National Memorial was established in the 90s or so, but it was never really funded as a national park. It wasn't an official unit of the National Park Service until President Obama is his first national park that he signed into law in 2010 to establish the Port Chicago Naval Magazine as an official national park site. So at the time, in 1944, the military was segregated. You had black sailors who were ordered to load and unload munitions, and white officers who were overseeing them. At that time, there was only the tidal area that existed, so there was no on-site storage capacity. Munitions would come in from the Midwest or other areas on train, and then basically be offloaded onto a boat right away. So this led to really unsafe working conditions and competition amongst the white officers. There was complaints of limited training, lack of safety protocols, and all of this led to the explosion at Port Chicago on July 17, 1944. So we're celebrating the 75th anniversary of that explosion as well. Next. It was the largest homefront disaster of World War II, and sort of astonishing to me, but it accounted for a quarter of all African American deaths in World War II.
Really?
Next.
Wow.
Following the explosion, white officers were given bereavement leave, were able to go off and take some time off. But the order to the black sailors was to basically get out there, clean up the mess, and continue to work. A number of them stood up and said, any order but that. That they had just seen their friends and family and others die in this explosion and be ordered to go back to work, and they recognized that the benefits of Navy life really no longer outweighed the danger that they were facing. They were tried for mutiny. They went under court-martial trials. Ultimately, we're told it was punishable by death. They were put on trial as held out at Treasure Island. It was actually 50 sailors, the Port Chicago 50, were put on trial. It was actually Thurgood Marshall's, one of his first cases that he came out and represented them as a trial lawyer for the NAACP. So subsequently, the Navy sort of, just because of the publicity of this event and the recognition of the injustices, the Navy began desegregation in June 1945, subsequent to the explosion into the mutiny. And ultimately that led to President Truman signing Executive Order 9981 on July 26, 1948, that desegregated all military forces. So a bit of history here in the Delta and in Concord that most people don't necessarily recognize, that directly was a catalyst to the desegregation of the military. So as I mentioned, the Port Chicago National Monument was recognized in 1992 to tell this story, and so it's been out there since that time. And then in October 2009 was when it was established as an official part of the National Park Service. But again, this is on an active Army base. It's not very visible, hard to get out there. So my agency has been working with the National Park Service on the park area that we're set to receive on that inland area to establish a new visitor center to highlight the history of the Port Chicago explosion and its aftermath, and to expand access to that story. July 17, 2019 would be the 75th anniversary. I invite you all on July 13th. We're going to be holding an event on the site commemorating the 75th explosion, and as I mentioned, hopefully signing the conveyance of the property officially from the U.S. Navy to the East Bay Regional Park District. And then I'll just mention on July 17th, the National Park Service also holds an event on site. It's a really powerful ceremony commemorating the victims there. So this is what we've been working on, developing a joint visitor center, like I say, highlighting the history of Port Chicago and the Diablo Valley. So this is just some schematics of our plans, reusing the bunkers, reusing some of the existing buildings. We've got a network of rail lines of about 40 miles that we're converting into trails. So really a big opportunity to provide access and tell some important stories. So that's where we're at. We kind of view this, converting this old military base back into a public park, being able to tell these stories, sort of a swords to plowshare story of converting an area and bringing it back to public use, and really highlighting some of the history and the stories that are on the site, while protecting some really sensitive habitat and providing recreation opportunities out there. So with that, thank you very much, and we'll go to Jean. That one seems to work best.
I think I will stand up.
Hello, my name's Gene Bigler. Just by way of introduction, I feel very amateurish in the context of some of the presentations I've heard and some that are coming forward, and some of my former colleagues that are here. Because my approach to the Port of Stockton and the work that I've done related to the Port of Stockton over the years came about in a very amateurish way, but it's an interesting story. As a freshman at University of the Pacific back in 1964, in my first spring vacation, I had the opportunity to spend 5 days on a houseboat with the family of a classmate of mine and 5 other classmates, and I became a devotee of the Delta and its virtues at that time. It was a fascinating experience. First time we were passed by large ocean vessels in the little houseboat in the Delta region, and the experience fascinated me. And so when I went on and developed a career in international relations, I got involved serendipitously in port development and other kinds of activities. I was involved in a number of projects, some at the World Bank and others during my career, and I ended up in Panama, where I was the responsible officer for the transition of control of the Panama Canal Zone to Panamanians and the control of the Panama Canal. And I've since, over the years, served as an advisor to the Panama Canal Authority on international strategic issues. All that's by way of background to the importance that I place on ports and international shipping as part of modern society. So in 2005, when I retired from the Foreign Service and joined the faculty at University of the Pacific, I was fascinated that most of our students and many of my colleagues didn't seem to know much about the Port of Stockton. So I put together a presentation about the importance of ports and especially the Port of Stockton in the global connections of Central California. And as a result of that presentation, I got asked to do a number of other presentations, and I began exploring the history a little bit. I even did a little bit of writing about the importance of the Port of Stockton. One of my friends was aware of this background and invited me to participate in this session. And so I'm sharing with you this very amateurish background that I bring to the subject, but because this is in fact the 75th anniversary of D-Day, and this is a time in which this connection to our community is relevant to the discussion, I hope I can contribute something from my background. What I'm going to talk about is just a little bit about the historic challenges that the Port of Stockton has had to meet throughout its history. I want to say a couple of words about the recovery of the community and the port from the crisis of the 1920s. Then we'll talk about the World War II expansion of the Port of Stockton and the way that has created what I consider to be a 100-year legacy for the Port of Stockton. And finally, we'll talk about how the Port of Stockton has become a fulcrum for the continuous growth and expansion of the city of Stockton and the Central Valley. So that's essentially what I want to share with you. I love this illustration of the Delta region because I think it shows wonderfully one of the interesting problems, challenges. The pointer doesn't work, but if you see way over here on the right-hand side of this map, you see the city of Stockton, and you see that it's on one of the smaller channels that are way out here from the really large channels of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. And it's much smaller, for instance, than that large Sacramento River channel that runs up toward the city of Sacramento. The thing that's fascinating about this is understanding the difficulty of navigating these waterways in order to get to the city of Stockton. And then, since these are all natural waterways, or most of them were to start with, one of the problems that you have is the impact of weather changes and heavy rains and floods and dry seasons and wet season changes is always going to be changing the depth and the width of the channels. So maintaining any channel for shipping over a long period of time, especially if it's a relatively remote channel, like the channel to the city of Stockton, that presents a real challenge. Nonetheless, the city of Stockton, from its beginning, turned out to be able to exploit the channel connection to the San Francisco Bay. And so from 1846 onward, the city of Stockton and its position in California history and its contribution was always related to the fact that that port first started with shipping some goods up the river, the port area, and then ferrying passengers as early as 1846, 1847. And gradually, it became a really important channel of communications. This is an illustration of what the Port of Stockton looked like in the early 1850s. And in fact, where you see this little house today is right opposite Weber Point today in the city of Stockton. So the channel still ends in almost the same place that it ended beginning in the 1840s. You can see a number of vessels off to the left. This was also one of the fascinating stories that I learned about, was that the majority of the gold that was mined during the gold rush was shipped out of the Port of Stockton and across Panama back to the U.S. Mint in Philadelphia. It's one of those kinds of global connections that you don't hear about, but actually was extremely important for Panama because it then led to the construction of a railroad across Panama in the 1850s. This is an illustration of the Port of Stockton in the 1890s. And of course, by that time, we had really gotten to the tremendous revolution of industrial wheat production in the valley. This building, the large building you see in the background, was a flour mill, and it was the second largest flour mill in the West Coast, and it was the beginning of the Sperry Flour Company. That was centered on the Port of Stockton, and during this era, they were able to maintain the Port of Stockton dredged to a depth of 15 feet. But during that era, the 1890s to the First World War, was an era of dramatic naval expansion and development of naval architecture. So the size of the vessels kept getting larger and larger. And so by the time we got to the 1920s, the depth of the channel to the Port of Stockton was no longer sufficient to serve the needs of the flour industry and other large-scale shippers. So Sperry flour moved in the 1920s to Vallejo. The same problem affected the business of Holt Tractor Company, which was the largest employer in the region during that era. And again, the lack of utility of the Port of Stockton, because they hadn't been able to keep the depth and the utility of the channel up to the standards needed, was one of the major reasons why Holt Tractor sold out and left Stockton in 1926. Nevertheless, the city and Stockton finally came together during the 1920s and developed a lobbying campaign which led to actually changes in both California and federal government support for port development activities. They led to a major project for deepening the channel, and so the channel finally reached 26 feet by 1933, and the Stockton Port Commission, which continues to exist to this day, was formed in that year, and at that point, in 1933, the first really large ocean-going vessel was able to reach the city of Stockton. The fascinating thing about that is that they realized that ship size was continuing to increase, so they immediately began another campaign to further deepen the channel to 35 feet. So that as the Second World War approached, the Port of Stockton was becoming an increasingly valuable potential asset to the war cause. When the war actually broke out, there were a number of things that were extremely important to the war effort that had to be, that the Port of Stockton was in a special place to support. One of those activities was the relocation of a number of the activities in the San Francisco Bay Area that were considered vulnerable to attack through the bay because of the potential of an attack from the Pacific coast. So a number of activities were relocated to Stockton. One of the most important was actually the submarine headquarters, which was moved to the Port of Stockton. In 1942, the Port of Stockton officially became an annex of the Benicia terminal and became a major site for activities related, support activities for supply in the whole Pacific theater. But one of the other things that just grew up almost spontaneously, it was a revival of something that had been a part of the port's history in the 19th century, and that was shipbuilding. The shipbuilding had been very important for a long time, but had declined at the end of the 19th century. There was still a little bit of shipbuilding in the early part of the 20th century, but there had been a dramatic decline. But with the advent of the Second World War, shipbuilding again became extremely important in the Port of Stockton. And so what you see here is actually one of the armored tugboats that was produced in the Port of Stockton area. A total of 125 vessels were actually built in the Port of Stockton during the Second World War. There were minesweepers, these armored tugs, and a number of other tankers were also built in Stockton. And it was a very important part of the total war effort. It was, in fact, industrially also tremendously important to the city of Stockton. At a time when the population of the city was about 60,000, the total employment just in ship construction in the Port of Stockton was over 10,000. One of the reasons why that was so important to the city was because the upgrading of the port facilities led to a situation in which a new labor supply was needed, just as we've already heard about the need for bringing bracero workers to California and the rest of the West to substitute Japanese labor. There was a need for new labor to work in these new industries. And this was the beginning of large-scale African-American migration to California, which was also able to supply the needs for the Port of Chicago facility, because the majority of the workers in the port area, well, actually I found different accounts of that. Some accounts suggest it was the majority, it was the majority in some companies. At any rate, there was large increase in African-American labor in the community in that era in order to meet the needs of naval construction. During the war, one of the things that fascinated me, again as an alumnus of University of the Pacific, I've always been fascinated by the importance of diversity and human dignity as part of the mission of the University of the Pacific. During the era in which the Asian Exclusion Act was passed in California, the University of the Pacific was admitting students from Japan and China, and they played an important role in the university. From a very early age in the period in San Jose, there were Filipino students. And at the time of the move to Stockton, the University of the Pacific was an integrated campus. It caused actually a violent clash with the Ku Klux Klan right after Pacific arrived in Stockton. One of the fascinating things to me about the history of the university was trying to understand why the theme of the inaugural address of Robert Burns as president of the university in 1946 was focused on civil rights. And as I came back and studied the situation, I became convinced that much of the experience related to the Port of Chicago and the trial of the African Americans there, and other controversies that had influenced the community during the war years had a great deal to do with President Burns' decision to dedicate the university's development in the post-war era to advancing civil rights. Now, with respect to what happened in the port, in order to do all of these things, and especially to do the service work needed to support the annex, the Medicia Annex, which meant that most of, for instance, the military vehicles that were shipped to the Pacific were actually unloaded in the Port of Stockton. There was a tremendous amount of need for space in the port. During the war years, the U.S. government added almost 1,700 acres around the periphery of the Port of Stockton to the working area of the port. Now, the federal government continued to control all of that, and it wasn't part of the Port of Stockton itself, but gradually, the creation of those facilities is what led to the expansion of the land needed by the port for it to continue developing. It also created the space needed for the full integration of railroads of that change that took place in the Port of Stockton during the war years. And then it was that period of time, in 1940, the population of San Joaquin County was 91% white. By the time we get to the early 1950s, the population of San Joaquin County is only 70% white. That major change was the beginning of the diversification of the population that is so important today. I've taken too much time, but I just wanted to show you just quickly. You can see up in the upper left hand, the very small part on the left is the eastern part of the port. All of the area that is in the West Complex and the Roberts Island Complex was added to the Port of Stockton during the Second World War, including all of the Stockton, the West Complex you see down there. That was all added during the war years. And that's what the Port of Stockton looks like today, and it maintains that channel of 35 feet. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Well, morning. Good morning. So glad to be here. My name is Carol Jensen, and today we celebrate D-Day, the invasion of Normandy. And so we're going to acknowledge this important day and move on to the importance of September 2nd, which is VJ Day, Victory in Japan. To that end, we're going to talk about the importance of the California Delta in the home front effort in winning World War II. To that end, we're going to go from the Pacific to, of course, the Mecca of the world, Byron, California. And its importance in winning, seriously, the war in the Pacific. So hold on to your hats. First of all, you all know where Byron is, right? I hope you do. It's that little dot right there in the eastern part of the Delta. Once you're in Byron, next stop, Stockton. Give you an idea of where you are. Let's take a look at the Byron Hot Springs briefly, established in 1865 and is a destination resort for the next 120 years. This is the Byron Hot Springs as it existed before World War II. It's a beautiful Italianate design, architecturally designed by the Reed Brothers of San Francisco. This could be you wearing your Ray-Bans and your tennis whites. This is a destination resort. People from around the world came to the Byron Hot Springs to drink the waters for their health. Give you an idea of the interior, this is what the Byron Hot Springs looked like literally in 1940. This is the interior of the hotel, the brick hotel as we see built in 1915. And the proprietress of the Byron Hot Springs. This is May Sadler Mead. She is owning the Byron Hot Springs after the death of her husband in 1918. She subsequently marries James Reed of the Reed Brothers Architects, who designed the building and other lovely places like the Hotel del Coronado, the Fairmont Hotel, and many, many famous hotels and buildings throughout California. May is the Contra Costa County chairwoman of the Women's Board of the Panama Pacific International Exposition, San Francisco, 1915. She is the youngest chairwoman of all the county chairwomen, and a very patriotic woman because when the war breaks out, she leases the Byron Hot Springs to the United States Army for $200. $200. Talk about foregoing the rent. Byron Hot Springs is going to become a military interrogation facility, jointly run by the Army and the Navy, and security provided by the U.S. Marines. It is not an internment camp. Here is our opportunity to link the speakers we've heard from this morning. This is not an internment camp. This is an interrogation facility in which Nazi prisoners are interrogated and then shipped off to American POW camps throughout the United States.
Right in Stockton.
And here, 3,500 Japanese prisoners of war, not American Japanese, Japanese prisoners of war are scooped out of the Pacific from this theater, China, Japan, all the way down to Australia. This is where individuals of strategic interest are being plucked out of the ocean, pulled out of submarines, picked out of lifeboats, and brought to California for interrogation. So let's come to California. Step one, if you're a person of high interest, you're going to come into Angel Island in the middle of San Francisco Bay for vetting. Let's see how much you're really worth in terms of education. Move on from there, And we'll move on to Camp Stoneman. So important. Camp Stoneman, Pittsburgh, is where every man who went to the Pacific went through on his way to Fort Mason, San Francisco, and then out to the Pacific. And every Japanese prisoner of war went through Camp Stoneman, either on to Minnesota, where the POW camp was, or to Mecca, the Byron Hot Springs, known as Camp Tracy, for interrogation. Here is our Angel Island. This was the Ellis Island of the West. If you were immigrating into California prior to the wars, you went through Angel Island. Of course, it shuts down due to the war and becomes a military outpost. And here, Japanese prisoners of war were brought in first. The immigration station, no longer for immigration, well, in a way, but these become military barracks and prisoner of war facilities. And you can see in detail these facilities, POW detention and screening. You can visit these today. Take a visit to Angel Island someday, and you can literally visit this very important site. On to Contra Costa County, of course, Camp Stoneman, where all those wonderful Delta steamboats are pressed into action for World War II activity. And the main gate. Pittsburgh looks a little desolate there, doesn't it? Really desolate. There is, of course, the river and Camp Stoneman. You can see, if every man that went to the Pacific went through Camp Stoneman, you can see how important and how extensive the properties were at the time. So let's go from Camp Stoneman to Camp Tracy. First of all, this is all secret. It's one of the best, well-kept secrets in Brentwood and Byron that everybody knew about, but nobody talked about. At Byron, you would be transported from Camp Stoneman to Byron in a school bus, blacked out windows, with military police motorcycle escort in the middle of the night. And you would come to the Byron Hot Springs. And this hotel, still there today, would you like to buy it? It's for sale. This building was both the location of the 35 military interrogators and the maximum 44 people at a time that would cycle through Camp Tracy for interrogation and then on to prisoner of war camps. Now, please note the windows here are blacked out. They're barred and screened. Here it is as opening for business in May 1942. Notice there's some improvements. Whereas May Mead is renting the facility out for $200 for the duration of the war, the U.S. government puts $50,000 in, quote, improvements, which of course includes fences, wiring, and electronic. Folks, every room is bugged. You couldn't whisper in that hotel without it being heard and recorded downstairs in the listening post. Again, the other side of the hotel, note again, the windows are blacked out. Nobody escapes. You can see it from a distance. This is after the war. You can see when the government bugged out, they ripped everything out, and it didn't quite look like the beauty it was in the 1930s, but here we are about 1945. The Camp Tracy facility was open from May 42 to December 45. And the prisoners come in the back end of the hotel. Indeed, through the back door. The prisoners came in and were processed. A prisoner would stay there at the very most 10 days. 5 to 7 days was the normal. And here we have a picture that should not have been released. This is one of the men who did work at the Byron Hotel, Blackie Black of Stockton. More on the properties. Here we have cottages, the Mead Mansion in the back, various medical facilities. Here we have a medical facility where if you had an appendicitis attack, we might help you. But not a lot. As in, how much does it really hurt? German U-boat person. How much does it really hurt? Tell me again how much it really hurts. And then you will be sent to another facility for appendicitis removal. Again, shots of the property during World War II. Not exactly as lush as it was, but you know, it is the military. It is a large facility. The Byron Hot Springs property is 160 acres, and the core is 40 acres. Remember, at one time this was a small hamlet of basically 20 people living on the property year-round. Again, we're taking notes of what's going on the property. We're documenting Japanese prisoners of war. So there it is. It's in Japanese and English. The individuals who are working at Camp Tracy, I am pleased to let you know, are a nice connection to our first panelists this morning. Individuals who were interned as American Japanese in the internment camps were given opportunities, and they did volunteer for the military. We have famous military units of Japanese involved in the invasion of Italy during World War II, and also we have the interrogators educated and trained at the Presidio, creating the military intelligence system that we know from Monterey today, that are literally going to Japan, going to the Pacific, and interrogating there. We have individuals who are at the Springs interrogating individuals, and I should point out these are interrogations that are not waterboarding. These are interrogations of, well, let's start with the food. The food at the Byron Hot Springs is all Japanese home cooking. It's home cooking. And indeed, this is a spa, so you have water. And if you're familiar with Japanese culture, springs and spas are very important. So the whole intention of this facility is to make the Japanese prisoner feel a little more at home, shall we call it soften him up, and ask him information such as where you're from. Are they building any aircraft in your area? Are there munition dumps in your area? Are there gas facilities in your area? Which side of the railroad tracks are they making the airplanes? Is that intelligence? Yes, it is. When American bombers are going over Japan, where do they bomb? They bomb on the right side of the tracks where the aircraft are being built, not on the other side of the tracks where the workers live. So we're talking about strategic identification of targets in Japan from just normal conversations with individuals who are involved. So we're eavesdropping. There are formal interrogations, yes, good cop, bad cop. Usually a white officer who coincidentally speaks perfect Japanese because he grew up there. Sons of missionaries, sons of businessmen, individuals who have been living in Japan all their lives, and enlisted men who tended to be the American Nisei. So the American Nisei is the good cop, and the American white officer is the bad cop. And so we are literally taking notes 16 hours a day on what is going on in the formal interrogations, as well as conversations between prisoners talking amongst themselves in the hotel. let's honor some of these World War II vets. On the right, we have Al Nipkow. You may have known him because he owned a clothing store in Walnut Creek for ages. And we have Japanese Americans. Next, and a list of all the soldiers that were assigned to Camp Tracy. Frank Shelby was a fire captain, resident of Stockton on the left, and on the right, he's pointing out on the right where the false ceilings were put into the rooms, where the bugs and the microphones were then embedded. Full floor plans of the Byron Hot Springs facility, both as its use as a hotel and as an interrogation facility, are available. Here again, we have veterans of Camp Tracy, who then settled in Stockton, returning to the Byron Hot Springs and telling, of course, the World War II stories that they experienced. And that is just the beginning. I could bore you for hours. Thank you very much.
Of any of our speakers? Anybody? Yes, sir.
Oh, I have a question for Carol. Well, we always hear about the POW camp in Clarksburg. So,
The POW camps where?
in Clarksburg.
Clarksburg. Those were not Japanese.
Yes. Do you know anything about that POW camp?
Indeed, there were POW camps throughout the United States in specific military districts. The Japanese had to be on the other side of the Rocky Mountains. I believe the ones in Clarksburg were specifically German. We had some Italian prisoners as well, but as you know, Italy capitulated. The Italians were allowed to either go back to Italy, or many of them, of course, stayed here and married good Italian girls from Pittsburgh. But we had a lot of German POW camps in the Stockton area, north of Stockton, Clarksburg, Windsor. You get your POWs as far away from Germany as possible, hence California. And Japanese, get them as far away from California as possible, put them in Minnesota and South Dakota. Fortunately, we didn't have many Italian POW camps for very long. We held a lot of Italian, well, the ones that we did have in Pittsburgh at Camp Stoneman until Italy capitulated. See me afterwards, and I know a good book called POW Camps of Northern California by Kathy Kilpatrick, and she'll tell you all about them.
Yeah, in the back.
I have a question for Janet. She was starting to talk about
Come on.
Yeah, could you describe what that is? I think we didn't get to finish that.
Gammon is a Japanese term of Zen Buddhist origin, which means enduring the seemingly unbearable with patience and dignity. The term is generally translated as perseverance, patience, and tolerance. And I think that's, we were all kind of brought up with that saying, it was kind of like, okay, this happened, move on, go forward. And I think Jean can say the same thing.
Any others? Thank you all very much. Thank you.